Hello and welcome back to another video of the Brainy Heart. Today we'll be talking about the arteries. We'll be labeling the main arteries, and these are the basic arteries of the body, and then we'll talk about how to memorize them easily, and then we'll talk more about the aorta. Let's get started by labeling the arteries. This artery right here is called the carotid artery. Below that is the aorta. Before we continue, I want you guys to know these 6 major terminologies: superior, inferior, internal, external, anterior, and posterior. Superior is top, inferior is bottom, internal is inside, external is outside, anterior is front, and posterior is back. These are some important terminology that you should know, and it'll make understanding the arteries way more easier. I'll leave these on the sides so that you can refer to them when we use it while labeling the arteries. Now back to labeling the arteries. This is the superior mesenteric. See, we are using superior. Superior. This is the inferior mesenteric. Under that is the common iliac. The common iliac is this artery right here. Just draw a line so that you guys don't get mixed up. Under that is the internal iliac, which is this. You might see why it's called the internal, because it's on the inside. And then this is the external iliac. Let's finish up the arteries on the left side as well, and then go into the legs. So this is the subclavian arteries. This, right under it, is the brachiocephalic artery. That is one of the arteries that branches off the aorta. Like I said, we'll talk more about the aorta after I finish labeling the arteries. The brachiocephalic artery is right here. Under the brachiocephalic artery is the brachial artery. I'll remove these circles just in case they confuse you. Under the brachial artery is the renal artery. And then you come down to the wrist. There, you'll find the ulnar artery. And then under that, I'm pretty sure a lot of you know, it's called the radial artery. So the subclavian is around the neck. The brachiocephalic is the artery that branches off the aorta. The brachial artery is an artery that's in the upper part of your arm. The renal artery is under the heart. And the ulnar and radial arteries are on the wrist. Now going to the arteries of the leg. The top artery is called the femoral artery. Under the femoral artery is the popliteal artery, and it is found in the knee. Under that is the anterior tibial, and below that, you guessed it, is the posterior tibial. And finally, the bottommost artery is called the peroneal artery. These are the basic arteries that you'll find in the body. There are a lot more. I just labeled them basic of the basics. I know this looks like a lot of arteries, but I use some interesting techniques to memorize them. Let me show you one of my techniques that I use that might be helpful for you. Now you might be wondering why I have a United States map rotated 270 degrees. Well, I used this map, this rotated map, to remember the locations of these arteries. I remembered the carotid artery as Washington, D.C. I remembered the aorta as Columbus. And Cincinnati was the superior mesenteric. And Indianapolis was the inferior mesenteric. The common iliac was St. Louis. And then I remembered Kansas City as the internal iliac, Wichita as external iliac, and the femoral, I used Denver, but you could also use Colorado Springs. It's totally up to you. And then after that, I used remember the popliteal as Salt Lake City, and Las Vegas as the anterior tibial. And I remember the posterior tibial as Frenzo, but some of you might not be able to remember where Frenzo is, as it's not as big of a city. So you could also use Los Angeles. Oh, LA, Los Angeles. And finally, for the peroneal artery, I use San Jose or San Francisco. I remember the subclavian artery as Pittsburgh, the brachiocephalic artery as Cleveland. Detroit was the brachial artery. And Milwaukee was the renal artery. And I remember the ulnar artery as Chicago. And finally, I remember the radial artery as Minneapolis. This is just my own map that I created. You could come up with your own set of cities, or you could use a different country, which you're more comfortable with. And that's one of the ways that I use to memorize the arteries. Now let's talk about the aorta. The aorta has three main arteries branching from it. The green colored arteries are the common carotid arteries. Sounds familiar. I hope this sounds familiar as we discuss this in the labeling part. The yellow color is the subclavian arteries. And finally, the purple one is called the brachiocephalic artery. Or while it leaves the aorta, it's called the brachiocephalic trunk. I'll just write that here. And the red part is you guessed it, it's the aorta. It's called the arc of the aorta. This line is pointing to the descending aorta. The descending aorta takes blood to the lower part of the body, to the legs and everywhere else. This is the coronary artery. And this is the ascending aorta. And you might have guessed this already, this comes in from the left ventricle. So like we talked about in the previous video, the oxygenated blood goes from the left ventricle through the aortic valve into the aorta through this ascending aorta part. And that's basically the aorta for you. That's the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm always open to comments, suggestions, and questions. Also, check out my blog at brainyhearts.wordpress.com. This is the Brainy Heart signing off. I'll catch you later in the next video.